Oh, hello there. I'm Ron Cook. Welcome to my workshop. I'm really glad you could drop by. Pardon the mess. Some have jokingly said that all I do is make sawdust for a living, but from this sawdust has come some very sweet sounds and a lot of music. What I'd like to do today is tell you a little about some of the instruments I build. I will cover the history and construction of 3 of them: the mountain dulcimer, mountain banjo, and guitar. I should tell you first that I come from a long line of artists, musicians, and woodworkers, going back to my great-grandmother, who was a very talented, self-taught painter, up to my brother, who was a fine caricaturist and artist. Nearly everyone in both sides of my family played music, mostly piano, but my father was a drummer in 1920s and early 30s dance bands. He was also a fine carpenter and woodworker. I'm very fortunate to have been able to combine all these inherited abilities into my craft, being an artist who can build stringed musical instruments. My interest in building instruments started with the mountain dulcimer over 30 years ago. That was in the early 1970s, about the same time I became a carpenter. During my whole musical past, my interests have been rather eclectic, to say the least, ranging from folk and rock music to international and experimental, and to classical, mainly of the medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque periods. Not only did I enjoy the music, I wanted to know what instruments the music was created on and how those instruments influence those we play today. Because of my varied interests, I've been working on several different types of instruments, like some of these behind me. I mainly build and sell early American and early European instruments. The early American, like the dulcimers, banjos, and guitars I make, date from the 18th through the 20th centuries. Some of their European ancestors that I build date back as far as the 6th century, like these. These 2 instruments are examples of those very early European instruments. Even though they look a little different, they are both called rotes. The rote is a type of lyre, which is a small handheld harp. It seems that these were the guitars of that age, around the 6th and 7th centuries, and were carried by soldiers and sailors wherever they were sent. This one is called a Germanic rote. It's called that because of where the 6th century original was found, in a warrior's grave in the Black Forest in Germany. It was cut and hollowed out of a single piece of oak, with a soundboard of thin oak pinned with wooden pegs and caulked with pitch, just like they used to caulk and seal ships. I should. This one is called a Saxon rote. The 7th century original of this was found in a buried Viking ship on the eastern coast of England in a place called Sutton Hoo. Those remains are on display in the British Museum in London. No one really knows how rotes were tuned or played, because that's all been lost to history. A few old paintings and statues have survived showing these instruments, but none depict a consistent playing style. They are all held differently. Because of this, modern players can tune and play these any way they want. You can tune to a chord, or dampen the strings, like this, or tune to a simple scale and pluck, like this. I was able to play Away in a Manger on the Saxon rote for my Folk Art Christmas CD that I recorded last year. You might notice the similarities between the 7th century Saxon rote and this instrument, a 13th century crowd, more commonly known as an English crowd. The shape is the same, albeit it's a little shorter, but this has a fingerboard and is bowed in a way similar to a violin. The early Nordic influence is there in the shape, but the bowing influence more than likely came from the Middle East, probably brought back by Crusaders. Now, I mention these instruments because they are the ancestors of the many types of stringed instruments that were later developed in Northern Europe, especially those called board zithers, which include the ancestors to our mountain dulcimer. This is a mountain dulcimer. It's also called the Appalachian dulcimer or lap dulcimer. Officially, it's from the family of board zithers because they're often shaped like long boards, and from the subfamily of fretted zithers. Now, the board zithers include those long Chinese and Japanese koto-style instruments, as well as the Middle Eastern and Western hammered dulcimers, and even the more recent auto harp. Fretted zithers include the mountain dulcimer because of its fretted fingerboard and all of its direct ancestors, which I'll explain about in a few minutes. Now, I played a mountain dulcimer for the first time in 1965. This was a time when both traditional and contemporary folk songs reached their heights of popularity with us young college-age baby boomers. Back then, there were two performers who inspired me, Gene Ritchie and Richard Farina. Gene Ritchie sang beautiful old ballads and country songs, many of English, Scottish, and Irish origin, and accompanied herself on her dulcimer. Richard Farina was a singer-songwriter who played his dulcimer along with his guitar-playing wife, Mimi Farina. They played contemporary songs in the folk music style of love, life, and protest. Now, the history of the mountain dulcimer has been rather difficult to research, since it's mostly oral history. It is known that the present shapes and tunings developed in the mid-19th century, but it is not known who invented them. It appears to have been a musical evolutionary change that happened simultaneously in several ethnic communities, from the farms in the Carolinas to the coal mines in Pennsylvania. Immigrants to the United States who came from Germany, France, Holland, Norway, and Sweden all brought the memory of their culture's instruments and music with them. The oldest known dulcimer ancestor is a fretted zither from Germany called a Scheitholt. This was pictured and described in the Syntagma Musicum by Michael Praetorius in 1620. It's very similar to this later French version called the Épinette de Vosges. But where this épinette is around 24 inches long, the German Scheitholt was around 30 to 36 inches long. Now, the Épinette de Vosges is from the Vosges mountain region of eastern France and dates back to the 1700s. The name means literally pines of the Vosges. The pines are the trees the instruments were made from. Mine here is made of apple wood from a tree a neighbor cut down. The Dutch and Swedish had a larger, wider version called the Hummel. Now, this one had up to 8 strings, but still had only one pair or a set of 3 to play melody on. The other strings were used as drones, And instead of a long, straight-sided box, like the Scheitholt and the Epinette, a single bout, or bulge, was added to one side, probably to help increase the volume. And the Norwegians had a much larger version called the Langilek. These were up to 4 feet long, with 8 or 10 strings, and were played mainly on the tabletop. Again, a single pair or set of 3 strings were fretted for the melody, and the rest were drones or bass accompaniment. Now, all these European instruments played a part in the development of the mountain dulcimer. Now, as immigrants settled in the Appalachian mountain regions from Pennsylvania to the Carolinas, they began to influence each other. And around the mid to late 1800s, the dulcimer shapes we know today emerged. Now, there are as many shapes and styles of dulcimers as there are players and craftsmen. The first mountain dulcimers were rectangular, large, box-shaped versions of the Scheitholt and Epinette de Vosges. By the middle of the 19th century, other builders, using any materials that were available to them, crafted instruments of many shapes and sizes, including diamond and oval shapes. In the second half of the 19th century, the more traditional teardrop and the hourglass shapes emerged. Now, I built my first dulcimer in 1973 because I hadn't yet learned how to steam bend wood, nor know where to get dimensioned wood. I built a coffin-shaped instrument out of spruce and mahogany veneers from a local lumber yard. And I put on tuning gears and fret wires salvaged from an old broken guitar I picked up at a flea market. And this is it. It isn't that big, as you can see, but it turned out that because of the very thin wood, it had a pretty good tone. And it still does. About the same time I built my coffin dulcimer, I began to get interested in early music. I spent a lot of time in libraries and frequented a lot of specialty bookstores learning all I could about folk instruments through the ages. One thing that intrigued me was the head carvings on medieval, Renaissance, and Baroque European stringed instruments. I decided to apply that style of carving to the next dulcimer I built, which is this one here. And I've been doing that ever since. Ever since I started doing these carvings, as many people have purchased my dulcimers for their sculptural and artistic value, as well as musical. Now, I did my first carvings completely with small chisels, files, and a lot of sandpaper. Now, I've now developed a technique where I do the main carving with a small handheld electric rotary carver, then do the fine work with tiny files and still a lot of sandpaper. I'm always making sawdust.